Hello, welcome to the latest episode of Called to the Bar, International Law Over Drinks. I'm, today one of your hosts, Douglas Guilfoyle, Professor of International Law and Security at UNSW Canberra. Today we are somewhat improbably celebrating the 50th episode of our little side project podcast series that we started just over a year ago. Turns out that what we all really needed was a place to chat and often vent about international law. So joining me today is the whole Called to the Bar crew. Dr. Juliette McIntyre of the University of South Australia, Associate Professor Imogen Saunders of the ANU Law School, and Associate Professor Tamsin Phillipa Paige of Deakin Law School, and Associate Professor Ntina Tzouvala of UNSW Sydney. To make the 50th episode, we have turned to crowdsourcing. Instead of us writing the questions, listeners did. A big thank you to everyone who submitted a question. We will do our best to do them justice, though we are not going to get through quite all of them, but that doesn't foreclose the possibility of a second episode of listener questions, in which we take up some threads. All right. Before we begin, I remind everyone that in these informal conversations, we are, as always, speaking off the cuff and without benefit of footnotes, and nothing we say should be taken to have been thoroughly peer-reviewed. But before we get down to business, our traditional first question, everyone, what are your drinks?
So it is 10:30-ish in 10 a.m., I should say, in Sydney. So I am having a peppermint tea with some Greek honey in it. And that is I just really want to say to all Anglos listening to this podcast, throw away your squeezy honey. Go and get some real honey. Thank me later.
As the pastry chef, former pastry chef, I endorse that. Real honey, good quality honey, delish, accept no substitutes.
And Tamsin, what do you have this morning?
So it's early for me because I am not a morning person. So I am fueled by coffee and resentment today. And the coffee is my usual patio beans, the Annabelle blend in my drip filter. But the mug is really important today. So holding the mug up because it's a visual thing for my co-host, I have a giant fucking alien mug that I got from the International UFO Museum and Research Center in Roswell, New Mexico. And it's fucking amazing.
Can confirm as someone who has a visual.
Well, 10 out of 10, recommend. It's the most batshit place ever. Love it.
I've got a good mug too, but mine's got my Lee-Bit on it, my slightly evil B-Rabbit K-pop guy. But yes, no, I'm also on the coffee. I've got a Japanese style, like drip filter Ethiopian coffee bean, which I ground myself.
Well, mine's also about the mug today. I'm having tea, but it's not the pattern. It's an American flag mug, but it's the perfect mug. It is the perfect size. It is the perfect thickness. It holds its temperature really well. And my brother-in-law actually bought me a set when he lived in America almost 20 years ago. And I loved it so much that when all but one broke, I went on eBay and found another set at a ridiculous price because it's the only mug I'll drink tea out of in the morning.
There you go.
Outstanding. I'm drinking green tea because I needed the mild caffeine release and the oxidants, and also it was what I had immediately to hand in my office when I realized we were recording in 3 minutes' time. So for our first question, we are starting big with nation building, courtesy of Alonso Gourmendi. If you set out to create your own personal state where you'd be ruler supreme, where and how would you go about it? Secession, claim an unclaimed part of the world? Go full Sealand? Tamsin, I think you have the most elaborate and well thought through answer to this question.
Okay, so anyone who knows me knows that I have a thing about, as a kid, I just wanted to grow up and be a pirate. I also have a whole thing about I just love steampunk and wish we were in a steampunk universe instead of whatever fucking timeline this is. So if I could just create a city, it would be a floating cloud city. It would be a massive floating city-state in the lower atmosphere, just wandering around, intentionally keeping to the high seas so we're not encroaching on other people's airspace and territory. And our entire economy would be fueled by dirigibles descending down and pirating billionaires' yachts. That's our entire economy is engaging in piracy against specifically just billionaire yachts. Everyone else gets a pass. We don't care. But billionaires, yeah, fuck that shit. You could surrender your money to the funding of the gay airship pirate cloud state.
I think it's
Nice.
downhill from here. No one has anything better. We can move on.
Imogen, did you have thoughts?
I did. So I did a little bit of a deep dive into microstates when I wrote an article on artificial islands and South China's island building activities China's island building activities in the South China Sea. Fascinating area to do a deep dive in. So I think I would go Republic of Minerva style. I'd find a low tide elevation and I'd build it up, but I'd be careful to do so in an environmentally sound manner, as much as I could. But I think the thing that I wouldn't do, and this is what actually gets a few micronations in trouble, is, under the Montevideo Convention, to become a state, you have to have relations with other countries. And so what micronation leaders often do is they start sending out diplomatic correspondence to other countries to try and get recognition. But when you do that, when you've actually set up, like Republic of Minerva did, a island on someone else's reef, and you send a letter to Tonga saying, by the way, can you recognise us? Turns out Tonga gets a bit cross and says, no, you're not going to build an island on our reef. And actually that's our reef. So I do it quietly and hope no one noticed me.
Excellent. My thought just went to claim an unclaimed part of the world. And I was like, well, what's left? And other than apparently some sort of sandwich of land in North Africa, which through some freak of mapping isn't actually claimed by anyone, my thoughts immediately went to, based on previous episodes, the deep seabed beyond national jurisdiction. And some people might recall the ridiculous, I think, mid-90s science fiction TV series Sequest DSV, where there were all sorts of colonies on the deep seafloor, and there were even submariner pirates. And it was all about resource extraction and kind of a scramble for the deep seafloor. So I hadn't actually got as far as how would I get recognized or what kind of sustainable economy would I have. I just went straight for, well, what counts as terra nullius? Oh, the deep seabed.
I love that we're counting my airship piracy of billionaires as a sustainable economy. I love this.
Well, it's only short-term sustainable anyway. I gasped when Douglas mentioned Sequest DSV. I loved that TV show when I was a little kid. I loved it so bad.
Who didn't? People without souls, that's who didn't.
Oh dear. I really couldn't answer this question. And so I ended up going, you know what, I'll just take something that people are fighting over and be like, none of you can have it. That was my sort of approach. I was like, if you can't play nicely, then I'll take this island away from you and I will have it. But I didn't get any further than that.
All right. So we have a follow-up, state-related question from Stacey Henderson, which is, if we did have our own states, what would be the national animal?
Okay, so the Free Pirate Cloud Republic of the general undetermined location, its national animal would be the albatross. Both because the albatross is known to just spend all of its time hanging out in the clouds, just doing its thing. But also, it's bad luck and basically illegal to kill an albatross if you're on a boat. So that just bodes well for the piracy.
I absolutely love that. So you've got your billionaires who see the albatross coming, but they can't do anything about it. And then the pirates descend from the sky.
100% exactly what's going on.
So I think for my island nation, my national animal will be a dolphin, because who doesn't like a dolphin?
Yeah.
For my undersea empire, I think for very Jules Verne related reasons, the national animal would have to be the nautilus.
Sounds good. Juliette?
Well, again, because I didn't really think it through, right? But I'm gonna, whatever wonderful native flora and fauna I've got on my island that I took from other people is what's gonna work. I'm hoping there might be puffins. I do.
Could you just go Scotland style where they've got a unicorn and instead go K-pop style and have Derpy Tiger?
Yes. Okay. Derpy Tiger is I will somehow create him. In fact, on that note, maybe I should take Dr. Island, because that's Japan and South Korea have been arguing over that little rock for several several years. So that would be appropriately themed. But I don't think either of them would be very happy with me if I took that island. So maybe I need to think this through some more. I don't see. This is the thing. I would not a leader of some small nation. I would not make. That is not my destiny. It's
So just on the reference to the Docto Islands in terms of podcasting being a visual medium, I'm now holding for everyone on the call one of my favorite international law pieces of memorabilia, which is a glass paperweight from the Korean Maritime Institute, which has set into it some kind of laser cut relief of the Dokdo Islands.
That's so cool.
That is cool.
So this is my proof that those islands are Korean rather than Japanese, is that I've got a paperweight.
So that's how we claim territory, is it? Just make paperweights.
Yeah. Make merch.
Yes, yeah.
Title to territory through paperweight.
Territorial acquisition through merch.
So I asked the question, but I also want to answer it. I have two options for my state, even though I don't have a plan where to building, but I have options for the animal, which is, I think Wales nailed it, the dragon. Like, no one said it has to be a real animal, so dragons it is. Or building on Tamsin's thought of anti-billionaire statehood, I would say the orca. Given the orca's, past record of disabling yachts in the Mediterranean, in the Atlantic, I think it's a close match between the dragon and the orca.
So what we're seeing is that the albatross would descend and the orcas would circle and doom would be approaching.
I would watch this show. I would definitely watch this show.
Okay, so our next question is tailor-made for our own procedure goblin, and I think it's from Mike Becker, isn't it?
Yes.
And so, Juliette, if you could change one procedural rule at the ICJ, what change would you make? And I'm going to add to it, and why?
Right. So I couldn't narrow it down to one, so I'm going to do three. I'm going to do three short ones. The two shortest ones. First of all, I would change the official languages, right? Because the court is a UN organ, but it only uses French and English, whereas everyone else uses the full array of UN languages. And I think that is not necessary or appropriate. I mean, you just as much need translation for those two languages. And we've seen really strange situations like two Spanish-speaking states, Costa Rica and Nicaragua, arguing over a Spanish phrase in a treaty in English and French, even though they speak Spanish and there's judges on the bench that are fluent in Spanish, so like these funny little things crop up because they're limited to these two kind of colonial languages. So that is one thing I would change. The second thing I would change is I would make more use of Article 15, which is the summary procedure chamber. This is like a little plug for a paper I'm musing over at the moment, but it gets formed every year officially, this summary procedure chamber, and it's never been used in the court's history. And I think now that the court is so super busy, they would do well actually to introduce some more formal summary types of procedures, even though states might want all the pomp and ceremony of full hearings every single time. Just for time management purposes, I don't think that's realistic anymore. And so I think we should do more with that. And then the big one that I would definitely change is the intervention procedure, because for a while there, it didn't matter because no one really used it. Now it's a mess. And having these two forms of intervention is really messy. It's really complicated and confusing because this question of whether a state has a legal interest for Article 62 intervention. And I just wrote a paper on this over the Australian summer, the actual legal effects of all of these types of intervention are not fully thought through, right? Like who is res judicata in these situations? Or can an intervener, even though they're bound by the decision, actually bring another case because they're not res judicata, because they're not technically a party, right? It's this whole mess, massive mess. When the intervention procedure was originally proposed, there was a proposal that got put up that said, look, just keep it simple and have it be that it's binding on anyone who intervenes. There's not this difference between party and non-party intervention. Just make it more straightforward. That's what I would suggest going back to, just to clean it up, basically. So yeah, those are I squeezed three into one, sort of. I couldn't help myself.
Thanks, Juliette. I think all of us were nodding along going, Yes, absolutely. Sounds great. So ICJ, please take note. We've got the reforms. Speaking of changes, our next question is a big one. Claire and O'Hara asked us, how would you fix international law? So Juliette, I might bounce to you first.
Yeah, okay. So sorry for going twice, but I've just got a really straightforward suggestion. So let's assume that you could just do one thing to fix the international legal system. And for me, that's actually a really straightforward answer. You get rid of the P5 veto, right? I know that you can't realistically do that, but let's wave a magic wand and get rid of it. Because, then I think that you just enter a space where, democratic agreement between states becomes much more of a thing, right? And you have to negotiate your use of force in this space, and you don't have the abuses of the veto power that we have seen from major powers. It's the one question that I just always get asked by students and the media, like, what is this veto power? Why is it there? What is it doing? It seems to be stopping everything from working. So that would be my one fix. There's plenty of other things you could fix, I'm sure, but that would be the big one for me.
Okay, so on the veto power and that, the why is it there? And I have a book chapter coming out that addresses this. It's there because fascism, and not for the fascism that you think, but because the UN was actually established on fascist principles of strength and security through might, by placing a whole bunch of people above the law. So there's that one. But I actually am going to come at this from a different point of view and say I wouldn't change anything to fix international law, because international law is not the problem here. People are the problem. 80 years ago, we implemented the prohibition on the use of force. So we've had 80 years of people creatively explaining why they're not engaging in a use of force or aggression. They're engaging in self-defense. Or, we have decolonization. So we have a new state that's entirely colonial, set up through decolonization because the British protectorate mandate left in 48, and then occupying territory through force and calling it self-defense and security concerns, or the invasion of Ukraine and annexation of territory because security concerns. The issue is the prohibition of force still exists, but no one's following it. The issue is not the law. The issue is people. And I don't have a method to fix people that doesn't involve genocide, eugenics, and general authoritarianism. So I got nothing here.
So to avoid genocide, eugenics, and maybe less authoritarianism, so mine would be, it wouldn't fix international law, but I think it would allow us to have conversations and fights from a better standpoint. Would be, I would go back and make sure that the prohibition of use of force in Article 2.4 also includes at least some forms of economic coercion. And also I would follow through that thread, for example, in the Vienna Convention of Law of Treaties, which is that treaties can be null and void not only if they were concluded based due to force or threat of force, physical force, but also due to some forms of extreme forms of economic coercion. And would that solve everything? Absolutely not. Would that even solve economic coercion? Probably not, right? Because then we would have to figure out, as Tamsin was saying, what is economic coercion as opposed to hard bargaining, right? But I do think it would give a better starting point for those states that are trying to resist economic coercion. And I think it would also send a sort of like message, which is that we understand is not just physical force that can destroy livelihoods and lives and states, that economic force can actually be much, much more destructive and cause much more pain and suffering. So yeah, would it fix things? No. And I agree with Tamsin that then everyone would just dislocate their arguments, not just to this is not aggression, it's self-defense. It would dislocate it to this is not economic coercion, it is hard bargaining, or it is just how markets work. But I think it would still be a valuable dislocation.
Yeah, That's actually a really good point, because I was teaching the nuclear weapons advisory opinion the other day, and we're talking about the way that the court sort of said, yeah, I don't know, nuclear weapons, man, kind of legal, kind of not, we don't know. And I sort of made the point, or I was thinking about it, having a hard line in the sand that says, no, this is not legal. It doesn't mean the behavior goes away, and it doesn't mean that, other lawyers whose job it is to argue their way around these things won't attempt to argue their way around these things. But having a really bright line that says, nope, prohibited, helps you work towards something. Whereas when it's not even prohibited, it becomes even less clear, less fluid. So, if we're waving our magic wands, I'd probably go back in time and change that opinion as well and get them to say, no, nuclear weapons are not legal. It's not going to make them disappear, but, it's something to work towards. It puts a cap on things. It puts pressure on things.
Yeah, and that point in the nuclear weapons advisory opinion that the court couldn't rule out the possibility that there might be circumstances of such existential threat to the survival of the state that use of nuclear weapons might be justifiable. Again, if I was going for the very utopian answer to fixing international law, there's always the sort of Philip Allott approach, which is the opposite of Tamsin's, that the problem isn't people, the problem is states. Now, I don't quite know how you go about abolishing states and still have international law. I mean, the worst case scenario is you wind up with something that looks probably a lot like the EU, but global. And the best case scenario is you wind up with something like Star Trek. But I don't. So there's a problem with the leap in the middle, but the centrality of the state is something we spent the 90s pushing back against, right? With the expansion of human rights and trade regulation and many other things. And now we appear to be seeing the return of the hard state in international law, which is a depressing thought, and I'll leave it there.
Look, perhaps related to some of these discussions, we've got a question from Gina Heathcote, which is, whose voice is missing most urgently in international law? And why is that voice missing? And what should we be doing about it?
I might jump in first on this one, because actually it comes right off what Doug was saying, because I think whose voice is missing in international law is people. And I think whose voice is overrepresented in international law is states. And the voice of the state drowns out the voice of the people. And here in particular, I'm not talking about sort of sovereign citizen type people. We had a pre-podcast chat about that issue. But I'm talking about non-state groups, so particularly Indigenous groups, people who practice customary law in Pacific states, non-state legal systems that are not often referred to in international law when we talk about domestic legal systems. And this is something that I've been writing about for a while, and Dina and I have written about it in the context of general principles of law as sources of law. But it really struck me when looking at the written statements for the ICJ advisory opinion on climate change. And both Vanuatu and the Cook Islands identified really powerful evidence from people of those nations about customary laws, and customary laws about stewardship of the environment and how climate change was affecting the way that people could look out for the environment. And I thought it was a really great opportunity for the court to actually draw on some of those principles. And when they're looking at what law should apply, to not just look at, well, what do states do about it, but what do Indigenous and other groups say about it? And unfortunately, they didn't. But I think those are voices that could be heard more.
Can I jump to say something on this, that it's not a coincidence that the two states that you mentioned are the states that Dylan Asafo and Margarita Wewerke saying, who we interviewed 2 weeks ago, were representing, right? And they brought like this sensibility to their advocacy, right? Coming from a very particular, from different, but still like sort of like critical, and in the case of Dylan, Indigenous legal traditions.
So I'm going to come at this from a different angle, and it is still people, but this one kind of cuts across cultures, and there's not a culturally specific one, but it's poor people. As someone who, came from a hell of a lot of poverty originally and who is still paying off a insane law school debt when supposedly we have, access to education in Australia and all of those other things, and looking at the fact that I could never afford textbooks or anything like that. The barriers to entry to having a voice and being at the table in international law for people who don't have means. And so then that becomes even amplified because I grew up and got educated in a country where I could just get student loans that just get garnished off my salary every fortnight and kind of, they just sit there and get paid, and I don't have insane debt. I don't have to pay international student fees and visas and all of that to get an education that will get me at the table. So I can't imagine what it's like being from a global south country that is a fairly poor developing country and trying to get at the table. So if someone who's come from poverty in an affluent nation doesn't see anyone like many people like themselves in the room, what the hell is it like for people from other places that are not affluent nations? And so, yeah, my one is, well, we need to get more people from backgrounds of not affluence and in the room, because that changes the conversation. And the example I'll give is I've read so many like security focused discipline papers where the people have been saying, we aren't really concerning ourselves with questions around housing security and food security and this and that, because that's kind of beneath the discussions we're having. And I'm like, no, that is the discussion you're having, because all of these other security questions are amplified when you don't have food security, when you don't have economic security, when you don't have housing security. And going to where I've done a lot of work, Somali piracy, almost entirely driven by economic insecurity. All piracy throughout history, economic insecurity, all of these things. You need more people in the room who have experience of knowing what it's like to decide if you pay rent or you eat. That's how you do it. Yeah. I mean, universal global education, taxing billionaires and corporations, eat the rich. I don't know, but that's who you need.
I want to bounce off of that because, I think that's such a good point. And Tamar Morris made an observation in a presentation at ANZL that even when, and please forgive me if I'm misquoting here, but it was basically to the extent that even when you've got representatives of what we would call, developing nations in the room in places like the United Nations, that the people from those countries are the elite people who have often gone to the same institutions. They've gone to the Oxfords or the Cambridges or the whatevers and been trained up in the same way that other elites have been. And so you're actually having this like elite to elite level conversation as opposed to a genuine sort of cross economic kind of conversation. I mean, obviously the states themselves do have different power structures, but the human people in the room aren't necessarily that different from one another. And I thought he made that point really well, and it builds on what you were saying, Tamsin.
Well, and also on that, Juliette, I mean, it's a sort of point I think made in passing in Anthea Roberts's Is International Law International? You say, they've gone to their local equivalents of Cambridge or Oxford. Well, very often they have gone literally to Cambridge or Oxford or the Sorbonne or some other, former colonial metropole. And you wind up with those elites who are not just having elite to elite conversations, but are, as it were, intra-elite, having been educated alongside the leaders of former colonial powers. And again, I mean, this point's obviously been made in the international economic law context. How much genuine diversity of views are there in kind of global leaders in the global south if they've all had educations in sort of fairly conventional economics at like Harvard or Yale or Oxford or what have you?
Yeah, absolutely. So my answer is somewhat, I guess, predictably, I think it has been shocking to me, amongst other things that have been shocking to me the past 2 years, the systematic exclusion from the centers of like, especially academic and public representations of international law, the exclusion of like Palestinians, right? We've been talking in international law about Palestine for a very long time, and there is a great number of Palestinian international legal scholars, right? Some of whom are doctrinal and formalist, some of whom are social legal, some of whom are critical, like some of whom you can, whatever orientation you want, you can find someone doing that type of work. And I have been really interested, and that's not the biggest problem with Palestine the last 2 years, but I've been noticing, let's say, the last couple of months, all these pieces proliferating in the press in which we get international law experts talking about, for example, especially the question whether what's happening in Gaza is genocide or not. And you would have 6 or 7 experts, 0 of whom, 0, are Palestinians. And I think obviously that speaks to a broader issue, like in the same way I think we don't get many Sahrawis talking about Western Sahara, etc. But I think especially that has been so obvious to me, and the ease with which we have accepted that as a given, that these discussions on state recognition or on genocide will be happening totally without Palestinian legal scholars. It is truly bizarre to me.
Yeah.
Well, not bizarre. It's totally explicable, but it is ethically bizarre, realistically explicable, to put it like that.
Yeah. And sorry, I know I'm talking a lot, but I wanted to jump on that too, because as one of the people who is often on the TV talking about these things, I have said to journalists, like, I'm not, they sort of often pre-ask questions, and sometimes I've been asked things like, oh, what does this mean for the Palestinian people? And I'm like, I can't answer that question. I'm not Palestinian. Like, I'm here to describe to you the legal situation. Like, that's something I can do, but I can't speak for them. Like, you need to find Palestinian people to speak for Palestine. Like, this is just what should be happening.
Yeah, and it's not like there's a dearth of Palestinian international lawyers, right? Like, for historical reasons, because of how central international law has been in the Palestinian struggle for self-determination, you can talk even to people who are not international lawyers, and they will have like a pretty good grasp of some basic international law stuff. So yeah, like and if like even one person listens to this podcast and after that is like, oh, maybe this panel that I'm running about Palestine or about state recognition or whatever, maybe I should try to get someone on the panel or in the whatever interview, whatever, I will consider that a win.
Well, and speaking of how, the only true experts in international law are obviously, 50 plus white guys, preferably with a lot of facial hair. The next question we had takes us right back to the voices of the first version of the World Court. And again, I think this is another Mike Becker question. So, gang, who is your favorite Permanent Court of International Justice judge and why?
Okay, I'll go first on this one. So my favorite judge is Judge Ad Hoc Seferiades, who was a Greek judge, and he's my favorite for a couple of reasons. Only one has to do with his judgments or the legal nature of his judgments. So the reason he's my favorite for the legal nature of his judgments is because he wrote about general principles of law. And that's what my PhD was on and my book was on. And so I got very fond of the judges who actually realized it was a source and talked about it. So big props to him for that. I also like him because he seemed like he was a pretty great guy. He was a poet as well as a judge. And his son went on to be, according to the article I read, one of Greece's most famous and beloved poets. He also, in his separate opinion in the Lighthouses case, he at the beginning specified, and in the first line, took the time to specify that all the dates in his judgment would be the Gregorian calendar, presumably to differentiate it from the Greek calendar. And I just like that sort of little pushback. Like, okay, this isn't this universal thing, guys. I'm going to use it, but, you know, just keep in mind that other people do it differently. So I'm very fond of it. And Dina's just pointing out that his son, in fact, is a Nobel laureate.
One of the only 2 Greece has ever had, yes.
Wow.
Yeah. He changed his surname into Safaris rather than Safariadis. And he's like one of the most famous, like sort of like modernist poet.
So that's I think it's pretty cool. So that's my guy.
That is super cool. I don't know if mine can top it, but we're competing now with our judges, but I chose Anzalotti. Okay, so obviously it's a name everyone I think is probably pretty familiar with, and it's not just some kind of like Italian nationalism.
I have no idea who you're talking about. So no, not everybody knows.
Yeah, Anzalotti. So he's like one of the guys. He helped to create the Permanent Court of International Justice. So he was one of the jurists who was involved in the creation of the court. And then he sat as a judge in many decisions. He gave us the definition of res judicata and the elements of res judicata. So he had a major sort of impact in that perspective. But I don't know much about his personal life, but I also liked just some of the other little things that he did. Like, for example, this might seem very small, but there was a advisory opinion to do with the Free City of Danzig, and there was a situation where the Senate of the Free City could submit written memorials and have oral statements made. But there were minority parties involved in that case, and they could only send written notes and they weren't allowed to participate in the oral proceedings. And Anzalotti was really critical of that. He's like, this is not procedural equality. We need to make sure that if anyone has a right to appear before us, that they get the full suite of rights, that kind of thing. And so, yeah, I really liked his approach in general to just ensuring that the court was, a fair and equal court and operated as well as it could. And I might have this statistic wrong, but I think he's also the only judge at the PCIJ that ever voted against his own home country. So he was very independent-minded, very, put a lot of stock in the importance of judicial independence, that sort of thing. So yeah, so he's my favorite for those reasons.
I'd like to remind our listeners, with me having no clue who anyone is talking about, that the vast majority of my scholarship is about fuck courts and law as a cultural phenomenon. So I actually have no idea about majority of any sort of court things that are going on in international law.
Well, my favorite PCIJ judge, and I haven't done any extensive research into his personal biography other than checking that there's not a controversies section on his Wikipedia page. So it's entirely possible that he was out shooting endangered animals or participating in the occupation of the Philippines with Teddy Roosevelt or something, but is the first American judge of the PCIJ, the spectacularly named John Bassett Moore. And I like him for 2 or 3 principal reasons. The first is that, he was probably the sanest voice in the case that drives me craziest, the Lotus case, which also has this crazy reputation for having split the court 6-6 and then being decided on the president's casting vote. But we're talking recently about the phenomenon of dissenting opinions that aren't really dissenting opinions. John Bassett Moore's dissenting opinion in Lotus was not really a dissenting opinion because he voted with the majority on every critical question. It was just that he didn't think that the passive personality principle had crystallized in international law yet, and he thought that the article of the Turkish Penal Code that Turkey was actually relying on as a question of fact could only be supported by the passive personality principle. But he actually came up with a completely legally plausible theory of the case that just relies on essentially objective territorial jurisdiction. 2 states can have concurrent jurisdiction over events at sea because, the act is initiated in one state's jurisdiction, one vessel, and completed in the other state's jurisdiction. So we'd normally call active and objective territorial jurisdiction, but here dealing with ships. So he's the only person who actually kind of, in my view, sanely analysed the legal question, but then just went off on this jag about, but that wasn't what the Turkish Penal Code was doing, so I can't actually subscribe to the majority outcome. He also came up with one of the most quoted statements about piracy that I've certainly used, and Tamsin, you may have used or not, but he talks about the well-established principle of international law that a pirate may be tried by any state into whose jurisdiction they come, which is just, he just phrases it very quotably and concisely as a formulation of universal.
I have read it. I haven't used it. However, my favorite quote on piracy, it was actually misrepresented and wasn't about piracy. It was about poetry, and it was a poetry critic writing about some poetry they had read. And that is the, at some point, everyone must decide if it is time to spit on their hands, hoist the black flag, and begin to slit throats. And that was in response to some poetry that a poetry critic had read.
Well, there you go. My last John Bassett-Moore factoid is that apparently, despite being pushed to run internally for president of PCIJ several times, he refused on the basis that it wasn't an appropriate thing for an American to be president of the court, because the majority of the states who subscribed to its statute was European, and you needed someone who was permanently based on the continent. Oh, and sorry, last, he founded a series that a number of us, I think, or certainly at least me and I believe Tamsin have published in what used to be called the US Naval War College Blue Book series. And so he made a substantial contribution to public international law in that way as well.
Didn't he also have a digest, like where all the treaties from that era were published? Like, did he edit that, or am I thinking of a different more?
Entirely possible. I don't have that level of granularity at my fingertips. I mean, but in terms of potential black marks against in his sort of copybook, he did, serve in the State Department under Woodrow Wilson, like, the notorious racist. So, no one's perfect.
So, Juliette, your question about treaties gives me a nice segue to our next question, which I didn't have, so thank you, because our next two questions actually do deal with treaties. Ben Hayward wants to know if we have tips for lawyers or non-lawyers who deal with international law as part of their work, but it's not the main focus of their discipline. What should they do better? And Mohammed Hussain Latefian is curious about how Australian courts can invoke international treaties.
So my kind of response to Ben's question is going to come off as odd, but international law is like tax law. And international law is like tax law in that it's really specialized, and within the specialty you have subspecialists of it. And so for non-lawyers or non-international lawyers dealing with international law, my biggest tip is to know enough to know when you have to get in a specialist, which is why it's like tax law. You want to know, a lawyer in practice wants to know enough tax law to know when to get in a tax lawyer to deal with it, and nothing more. And to know your limitations on your knowledge, because we are all very well aware of the contract law barristers writing op-eds about how international law isn't real and doesn't do any of the things that it says it does, who are entirely wrong and just make us all fucking crazy. Don't be that guy. So that's kind of my tip there. In response to Australian courts and international treaties, I kind of go back to Kirby's separate concurring opinion in the unanimous judgment of B and another, and the Minister for Immigration from the High Court. It was a children in detention case, and it's a fantastic judgment. It's well worth reading, and not just because, like, I love Kirby and all of those things, but he starts off by saying that as courts are to interpret statute in light of Australia's international obligations, unless the statute is written in such a way that demonstrates an intention from Parliament that international law is not to be followed in relation to this statute, and then goes off about how the Immigration Act on refugees and children in detention demonstrates that, and that the government's evil. But that kind of sums up for me how Australian courts can invoke international treaties, which is because we're a state that requires international law to be incorporated through domestic statute in Australia, that a kind of interpretive rule set out in the High Court by Kirby is kind of the real, I think, touchstone. And that judgment from Kirby, he's drawing on other judgments beforehand. I can't remember which ones to create that. It's the clearest, I think, articulation of that principle.
Yeah, and I totally agree with all of that. But I would add also that I think I don't have anything to add to Ben's question. I'm sorry. So I'm just going to go straight into the Australian courts question. Because, of course, I think our judges sometimes forget that we in Australia are a common law system, and they are actually entitled to make law. And I think that that's a space where we could see a greater implementation of treaties or even customary law through those principles. So going right back to, the Mabo case and Justice Brennan, I think it was, saying, that international law is a legitimate influence on the development of the common law. It's a source that judges can draw on. And same for treaties, right? Like, there's no reason why, if the executive has entered into a treaty, even if that treaty hasn't been directly implemented via legislation, we've obviously undertaken at some legal binding level to adhere to those principles. And our courts are perfectly entitled to look at those promises and bring them into Australian law. So I think my, sort of comment would be that our courts are just so deferential to legislation and to Parliament, and they actually need to remember that they are the third and equal arm of government. Their job is to create law in certain spaces. Their job is to actually hold Parliament to account in certain spaces. And I think, making sure that we are, in fact, keeping our promises when it comes to international law is a role that judges can and perhaps should be playing. Because you look at the recent or relatively recent environmental law cases that we've had in Australia, like the Sharma case and the Torres Strait Islander case, these just like failed, right? Sharma, admittedly, at first instance was more successful. But we've just seen the International Court of Justice find that actually some of these ideas about ensuring the protection of the environment for future generations and things might actually have the status of customary international law, right? And our courts had opportunities to say, yes, we recognize the existence of these rights in Australian tort law, for example. But yeah, I just think they could be stronger about it. They don't need to be scared of international law. It's not this weird beast that isn't available to them for some reason. We are geographically an island. We're not an island in a legal sense, right? We can draw on these principles. That's my rant.
So I will answer the first part, which is those who work partly but not squarely within international law. And I will answer it not so much from the perspective of legal practitioners, but let's say scholars, like IR scholars, history scholars, whoever whose work intersects with international law. And in a sense, my advice would be exactly the same advice as I would give to international lawyers whose work intersects with history, IR, or whatever, which is never, ever say international lawyers say X or international lawyers say, like, think Z. They do not. Not all of them do. Some of them do. Some of them think that X or Z is the most outrageous thing that anyone has ever said. And interdisciplinarity cannot be an avenue for cheating. So an avenue of basically introducing authority from a different discipline without having to account for it, but by just saying, oh, this is just common knowledge between economists. No, it isn't. Economists, like all other disciplines, disagree with each other, and different opinions have different methodological and political valences, etc. So it's the same for others, either legal scholars from other subfields or other disciplines. Name names. Tell me who says that. And it could be the predominant opinion, but it is unlikely. I think you would be quite in trouble to show me a statement that is not quite trivial that you could get even those 5 international lawyers in this podcast to agree, let alone international lawyers as a whole. So that's my rant. I think do not use international law as a shorthand and international lawyers as a shorthand for the argument that you have to make and you cannot outsource to another discipline to make for you or subfield to make for you.
I'm also going to add to that. Don't cite John Yoo. Just don't. Have some standards, have some ethics. Don't cite John Yoo.
Unless it's contra. I think that's...
Yeah, unless you're citing him to show how much of a fuckhead he is.
No. See, I think, because I used to do the hate cite. Like, I had people that I would hate cite, and then I realized I'm just giving them citations. So I've stopped doing that as well.
But sometimes you just need a whipping boy, right? Like...
So the best one I've seen on that one, Imogen, with the hate site is literally John Yoo says X, and then a footnote that says, for ethical reasons, I'm not going to cite this douchebag. But here's a link to his Google Scholar page, so if you really want to find all of his awfulness.
That's awesome.
Oh my goodness. This has been so fun. Thank you everyone for submitting these amazing questions. We actually are down to the last question for the pod, which is one of our favorite questions. And again, it comes from Mike Becker. Mike, you gave us some great ones, so thank you so much for that. As we usually end the pod on a lighter note, the question is this: who should play each of you in the Netflix series about Called to the Bar? Who wants to go first?
Oh, look, I'm happy enough to go first. I gave this sort of quite a bit of... I gave this probably far too much thought, in fact. And despite the usual disagreement between Australians and New Zealanders about the correct accent for this part of the world, I went with Jermaine Clement, who I think is a fabulous actor, despite the fact that he plays quite a few sort of geeky, offbeat roles. He's a very suave person with a fantastic speaking voice and an incredibly offbeat sense of humor.
Douglas, you and geeky and offbeat? Shocked, I tell you.
Shocked to find that happening here. Probably best known for the TV series Flight of the Conchords, but also did a fabulous turn in parallel to the regular Marvel Universe TV series Legion as the character Oliver Bird, and appeared as one of the vampires in the original movie, not the TV series, What We Do in the Shadows. Otherwise known for his voice work on just about everything, but perhaps particularly as the giant shiny crab in Moana.
Shiny. Oh, that's such a good answer. I think we can top that. Who's next?
I'll go next. So mine is Katie Holmes, and it's because of her Dawson's Creek days as Joey. And there's 2 reasons for that. One, actually, weirdly, international law related, and one much more daggy. So the daggy one is because I spent way too much time in high school practicing how to do that sort of crooked, lopsided smile she does as Joey, in the mirror, the whole thing. So I figure I at least can smile like that, and then she can play me doing it in a sort of meta moment. But the other reason is when I was in university, I did the Jessup Moot, and my team went to Washington, DC. And there was a channel in the hotel that just played back-to-back Dawson's Creek episodes, and that's all it played. And so when other people were getting ready for the moots, I was just sitting in my hotel room watching Dawson's Creek. And it was a great moot preparation. So I'm going with Katie Holmes.
Excellent choice. Ntina, Tamsin?
So I read the question carefully, and at no point does it say that it should be a real person, like that it should be an actor, right? It says who would play you. So I lawyered the shit out of this question. Okay, so the TV character that I have ever in my whole life identified the most with is Nadia of Antipaxos, which is, for those who are not connoisseurs, the Greek Romani vampire from What We Do in the Shadows, not the film, the series that recently concluded. I feel a very deep affinity to her. And I think she should, therefore, not the actress who portrays her, whose name I think is Nastasia Dimitriou, but actually the character should play me in a Netflix series. It's the character who has the incredible line, "I'm going to escalate things to crazy levels," which I feel truly captures something about my essence.
Excellent. This is amazing. This is maybe the best question we've had. Tamsin, who
I
is
like
your...
the strong vampire theme though coming
Yes!
through with like, what we did in the shadows as a linking note.
What does this say about us?
So I am, despite my regular consumption of much trashy vampire fiction, going with a non-vampire set of options. So I have two options here, and the first is Lena Headey, and not for her weird Game of Thrones things, because but for her performance in Imagine Me and You, which was like the iconic lesbian rom-com. Her performances in the Sarah Connor Chronicles, her performance as Mama in Dread, which I just would love her to channel that as me, and her performance in St. Trinian's as the weird English teacher. She's phenomenal and a lesbian icon, although I think possibly straight. So that's a bit weird, but lesbian icon in and of herself. So that would be option one. And option two is Keira Knightley, because if I don't get to be Elizabeth Swann, which was like my entire childhood dream was built around escaping to be a pirate, then Elizabeth Swann can be me.
Perfect. Bravo. Okay, so mine is maybe a little bit more basic Hollywood, but I'm going with Anne Hathaway because I actually love her Princess Diaries. I would like to think there's a vague physical resemblance, and also she met one of my stray kids at a Versace event. So maybe if I get to meet her, then I can slowly work my way towards meeting my idols. So this is a slightly self-interested casting as well. But no, I actually think she's fabulous. She was so great in Les Miserables. And I did some Les Miserables stuff when I was in high school. So yes, she would be.
She was
my
also
choice.
phenomenal in The Devil Wears Prada and in Ocean's 8.
I love that movie. Yeah, like she's actually, I think she's really underrated, actually.
Yeah, and as Catwoman in one of the Christopher Nolan Batman films as well.
Yeah.
Didn't Katie Holmes also appear in one of those Batman films?
I think she did.
There we go.
There we go.
It's all coming together. So yes, Netflix, give us a call. We're your next big hit, I'm sure.
The biopic of Called to the Bar. So I have one last question, which I don't think we've addressed and I don't think we've put in the script. But Douglas, tell us what you're wearing.
Oh, well, today I'm wearing green cord trousers, not visible on the Zoom call, but in particular, I am wearing a green Yorkshire wool waistcoat and matching jacket with a strong kind of blue and light green window pane check and a vintage gold and green paisley tie.
Very nice.
Excellent.
I'll link to an academic selfie in the show notes. Well, everyone, thank you for listening to us rant in relation to this exceptional collection of often quite eccentric questions. Thank you for sticking with us for 50 episodes of Called to the Bar. We can't guarantee necessarily another 50 to come, but this is far from the last episode. So thank you so much, everyone, and bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening.
Bye.